This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 730 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I wasn't totally happy with the results of last week's Sleeper Show. Matt Ryan played with a really weird game script, and he didn't really come through as a streamer. That Mike White injury really derailed things too, as did the fact that Ramondre Stevenson ended up playing. And then one of my biggest misses of the week was with the Texans' backfield. That ended up being even more of a mess than what we originally thought. There were a handful of good hits though. The streaming defenses were pretty good, and both Rashid Shaheed and Jawan Johnson got it done. But overall, it was a below average week. Now, before getting into the sleepers for week 16, I want to remind you about the NBA Clutch Shot presented by Buzzer, an NBA DFS contest taking place every Wednesday from now until March that gives you a chance to win a share of FanDuel's biggest prize pool. Simply construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap and follow along as the games unfold using FanDuel's live scoring feature. Earn points for points scored, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks, and watch as your lineup climbs the ranks. The higher up the leaderboard your lineup finishes, the more cash you'll win. It's that simple. The contest is live, so visit fanduel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1 and submit your lineups now. That's fanduel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1. So before I get going with this, I want to make a general statement about this week's slate of games, because it's rough. There are weather concerns all across the country. So make sure you're paying attention to weather forecasts before blindly plugging a player into your lineup. There are some really low game totals this week that are being impacted by bad weather. But as is the case each week, we'll kick things off by looking at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll start with Gardner Minshew. Now, at the time of this recording, I don't know if Jalen Hurts is going to play or not, officially. But it definitely sounds like it's unlikely that he goes, which means Minshew would be the starter for Philadelphia. We saw him get a couple of starts last year for the Eagles. He scored 19 and 14 fantasy points. Not bad. Now the Eagles are improved offensively and have a better arsenal for him. And according to FanDuel Sportsbook, they've got the 14th highest implied team total on this week's slate. Dallas is not an easy matchup on paper. They're the fourth toughest one when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. But they're coming off a game where Trevor Lawrence threw for over 300 yards and had 4 touchdowns. And the Eagles have been good at handling pressure this year. They have the best pass blocking grade in football according to PFF, so they might be able to handle Dallas, the number 1 team in the league in pressure rate. So I don't think Minshew's that bad of a streamer, given the weapons that he's throwing to. I would play him over Brock Purdy, but I don't mind Purdy. Like I said in the 15 Transactions show, he does have a little bit of touchdown regression heading his way, but he's not a terrible streamer. He's thrown a touchdown on every 102 passing yards. That's way better than the league average. And he has a 6.5% touchdown rate. That measures touchdowns divided by attempts. That's also a well above average mark. But the 49ers do have a strong implied team total this week. And it's not easy finding quarterback streamers. I don't love the matchup against Washington, but they've been more beatable this year through the air than on the ground. They actually have the best rush defense in football, according to NumberFire's schedule-adjusted expected points model. So Purdy can still work, though I'm not sure his ceiling is super high. Now moving on to running back, Tyler Algier saw a slight uptick in work this past week with Caleb Huntley suffering an injury. Now he gets an average matchup against the Ravens. As I mentioned on the 10 Trends episode, the Falcons were still super run-heavy last week, despite running so many plays while trailing. I'm not concerned about the Falcons going away from the run. And Algier has seen double-digit carries in each of his last 3. He's not an amazing play, but he's a running back seeing volume who might be sitting on your waiver wire. That's good enough. Now, in that same game is Gus Edwards. J.K. Dobbins is currently likely to go this weekend, but he did miss practice for some maintenance earlier this week. Edwards has seen running back rush shares of 43% and 32% over the last 2 weeks. And while that hasn't translated into special fantasy performances, the Falcons are beatable. The Ravens not only could just flat out see a great game script in this game for their running backs because they're 7.5 point favorites, but Atlanta's the 10th best matchup in adjusted points allowed to running backs this year. It's hard to love Edwards. He's not going to see a lot of work through the air, if any. But like I said, it's hard to find running backs on the waiver wire who are seeing any sort of volume. And then I think this last spot to look at with running back is in the Colts backfield. I do like Zach Moss most because he played 2/3 of the Colts snaps against the Vikings, and he had a decent game carrying the ball 24 times. The Chargers are the 7th best matchup for running backs, and they've been beat on the ground this year. So there's a chance that the Colts lean on Moss in that backfield. But Deion Jackson might be the PPR play. If this game script goes south, which is very, very possible, then Jackson will likely gobble up some of the targets in that backfield. But there is one thing to note. The Chargers actually rank 26th in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. It's not necessarily a good receiving matchup on paper for this running back group. If you're desperate for a flex play, going Moss in standard or half PPR leagues, that makes some sense. And you could even risk Deion Jackson in a PPR format. You're just playing the game script game more than likely if you're doing that. Now at wide receiver, even with Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller back last week, Mac Hollins got it done. He had a 25% target share and he scored 14 PPR points. And he's now averaged a target share per game of almost 24% over his last 5. Pittsburgh's secondary is not good. They're the 8th best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now that game environment doesn't look all that great, partially due to weather concerns, but Hollins is a viable wide receiver 4. Nico Collins and Brandon Cooks, they could miss yet another game this week. So Chris Moore has to be on your radar. He's seen target shares of 46% and 33% over his last 2. 2 games without Collins and Cooks. And the Texans get a Titans team this week that's been the absolute worst against wide receivers this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, it kind of projects to be an ugly game, especially if Ryan Tannehill can't go, which is very, very possible right now. But that high of a target share deserves attention. Now, probably my favorite waiver wire wide receiver play this week is Marquise Goodwin. Tyler Lockett's injured, and he's had a 24% target share in Seattle's offense this year. I'm not someone who believes a player will just completely take that on because targets are earned. But that target share is going to be dispersed throughout the Seahawks offense. And I'd imagine Marquise Goodwin will see a good chunk of it. He's seen 3 games this year with a target share at or above 15%. And he'll play as the team's number 2 receiver. Back in week 7, DK Metcalf played just 28% of Seattle's snaps. In that game, Marquise Goodwin had a 19% target share, and he scored 22.7 PPR points. Now the Seahawks get the Chiefs. They not only could have a pass-heavy script, but KC is a top 10 wide receiver matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Goodwin makes plenty of sense this week. The Baltimore Ravens have no wide receivers. Rashad Bateman's been out, and now Devin Duvernay's out. The Ravens got Sammy Watkins this week. That's what we're dealing with right now. The de facto number 1 guy is Demarcus Robinson. He's played by far the most snaps in that offense among the healthy wide receivers. And the Ravens have a plus matchup against the Falcons this week. Atlanta's the 6th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, I don't love Robinson. If Tyler Huntley goes again, we know that he's struggled. And the game environment in that one could be bad for the passing attack. But Robinson does have a 23% target share per game rate over his last 7. And that could even rise a little bit with Devin Duvernay being out, even though Duvernay hasn't been that involved as a receiver. So DeMarcus Robinson works, but I don't know if I absolutely love him. Now, the worst weather game this weekend seems to be the one going on in Cleveland. You've got the Browns facing the Saints, and that game total, it's hovered around 32 points all week. There's going to be high winds, and that can really impact fantasy football. So let me ask you this. Would it shock you if the Saints and the Browns both go with a run-heavy approach? Probably not. And if they do that, wouldn't Taysom Hill make a lot of sense? He's still rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues. I wouldn't be surprised if the Saints give him a little bit of a bump this week, given the weather circumstance. Now, this is more subjective than my standard take, but I think he makes sense as maybe a lower-end tight end 1 or a higher-end tight end 2. Now, I talked about Tyler Lockett being out, and that could funnel targets to Noah Fant and even Will Dissly. Fant is my preferred choice between the two because he's been a little bit more productive of late, but they both run a very similar number of routes in that Seahawks offense. The Seahawks have a 24% tight end target share this year. That's 3 percentage points above the league average. And I wouldn't be surprised if that inches closer to maybe even 30% this week, given that Lockett injury. So I like Fant, and I think Dissly even makes sense as a deeper streamer. Now we're on to players rostered in 0 to 10% of Yahoo leagues. I hope you don't have to rely on these guys in your semifinal, but you never know. The only quarterback I've got for you is Sam Darnold. And no, of course I don't feel great about recommending Sam Darnold. The The Panthers are hosting the Lions. Detroit is the number one matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed. That's really the argument. Zach Wilson was QB9 against the Lions last week. Just a handful of weeks ago, Daniel Jones was the QB5. Quarterbacks against Detroit over their last 8 games have averaged a weekly ranking of 6.5. That's insane. Now, of course, this game isn't being played in a dome, and the Panthers love to establish the run. They've been at or below a 40% neutral script pass rate in 4 of their last 5 games. They're going to try to run it against Detroit, but the Lions have been great at stopping the run during the second half of the season. So I could see a scenario where Darnold is forced to air it out a little bit. Now, I talked about Royce Freeman on the 15 Transaction Show, and you know that I don't absolutely love him. He didn't even lead the Texans in snap share this past week, but he was the most effective rusher for them. If you're desperate, I could maybe see him being a flex play with the hope that Ryan Tannehill doesn't go for the Titans. At the time of this recording, I don't know if he's in or not. If that happens, then the Texans have a higher probability of keeping it close. That would help Royce Freeman, and maybe the Texans just want to reward Freeman anyway. It's not the best matchup in the world, and it's a crowded backfield at this point. There just aren't that many sub 10% running backs to look to this week. Joshua Kelly's another one, though. He's seen a 40% running back rush share or higher in 2 of his last 3, and there's a chance the Chargers see a positive game script against the Colts this week. That's what you have to bank on with these lower-tiered running back plays, game script. The Chargers are 4.5-point road favorites, and Indianapolis is a top 6 matchup for running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I think Kelly's an interesting deep play. Now, I talked about Sam Darnold, and Terrace Marshall naturally makes some sense in this tier too. Detroit's the 5th best matchup for fantasy wideouts in adjusted points allowed, and Marshall has averaged about a 17% target share over his last 7 games. You just have to cross your fingers, like I said earlier, that the Panthers attack the Lions' weakness and aren't stubborn offensively. Isaiah Hodgins is one player that I like more than Marshall within this tier. I've attacked this matchup against Minnesota all season because they've been one of the worst teams in football against perimeter wide receivers. Hodgins has barely played in the slot this year, and he's seen a 17% target share per game over his last 4. And across that time frame, he's averaged 11.3 PPR points per game. I like Darius Slayton more from that same offense, but Hodgins makes sense as a deeper play. And then I've got 2 deep tight end plays for you. One is from that same Giants team, and that's Daniel Bellinger. I know he didn't have a great game last week, but that was partially due to a tough matchup. The Commanders are one of the best teams in football against tight ends. Bellinger still saw a 13% target share, and he ran the 5th most routes at tight end last week across the league. Minnesota this week is a top 10 matchup for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And then finally, Cade Otton. Otton ran 1 fewer route than Cameron Brate last week, and he's now run 9 more routes than him over their last 2. And this one's really all about the matchup. Arizona's the 2nd best matchup for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed. They rank 1st in percentage of receiving yards allowed going to the tight end position. And they're tied with Seattle in number of top 12 tight end performances given up. So you can go with Otton, but you could even look at Cameron Brate too. And very quickly, let's just talk defense. Cleveland's in that low over-under game against the Saints. They're definitely in play, but so are the Saints. They're both pretty safe options. You can look to the Steelers in an iffy weather game against the Raiders. The Chargers get Nick Foles as decent favorites. Detroit could get it done against the Panthers. And Cincinnati against New England, they work too. There's a lot of good defensive plays this week, but those are the ones that are most likely on your waiver wire right now. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Mailbag Show.